Hey, there you are. Come on in. Let's go talk about pocket knives. Here is a Schrade Barlow with a broken pen blade. I bought it a few years ago to repair it and only now have selected it out of my project box. I will begin disassembling it by using a ball burr on my rotary tool to create a deep dimple in the center pin. Then I will drill the pin out. I'm using a starter bit to drill out the head of the pin. I stop and clear away the shavings often to be sure that I remain in the center of the pin and don't ruin these handles. Now these handles are plastic, but they do look nice and I don't intend to replace them. I will use a small punch to drive the pin out. I try to keep multiple sets of these punches as they bend and break very easily. Incidentally, this wooden block is a piece of scrap that I began using when I first started working on knives. I have another, but I've continually used this block of pine wood for over 5 years now. I believe this knife is constructed using Swinden rivets since it's a Schrade. That means it should slide apart after the center pin is removed. I find that it does have a Swinden rivet, but only at the pivot end. The rear end is also pinned, and I'll have to drill out that pin as well. The Swinden rivet system consists of a steel rivet that holds the blades in place, while the bolsters have a keyhole system that allows everything to snap together. This makes for easy assembly and disassembly, unless you cut that steel rivet to replace a blade. The Swinden rivet was made using some very sophisticated machinery, and it's not easily duplicated. While I have it apart, I'll check my springs for wear, and there is none. This knife appears to have been used very little before that blade was broken. On most Schrade knives, I remove the Swinden system, drill out the bolsters, and pin the knife straight through. But with these fancy engraved bolsters, I could never make this knife look right again if I did that to it. I've been told that you cannot make a Swinden rivet by hand, so I say challenge accepted. Before I cut this rivet, I use some feeler gauges to see how much clearance I have between the blade and the head of that rivet. I find that these two fit perfectly, so I'll use them to make a new one the correct size. Well, hopefully at least. Once I cut that rivet, I am committed to either making a new rivet or ruining these bolsters. I have chosen a replacement blade, so now it's time to try to make a Swinden rivet. I've never tried this before, and while I have a general idea of what I want to do, if I had to do it over again, there are some things that I could do to improve the process. So if I point these things out along the way, I want you to know I'm not being overly critical of my work. I'm only showing you what I learned. I've already turned this pin down to the correct size with the drill and sander, and now I will pre-peen one end. Doing this drives the pin downward in my clamp, so I have to re-clamp it at least once, because I'm peening this far more than I normally do a pin. Now, here are two tips that I'll keep in mind if I ever have to do this again. First, peening a pin this far hardens the brass and causes it to crack. I should stop and anneal or soften the metal once or twice during the process to prevent it from cracking. Second thing I learned is my clamp works, but it forms the head of this pin out of round. I should have put the pin through a blade tang before peening it to peen it against a flatter surface with a round hole, keeping the pin round. And now that I have one head of the pin formed, I will try it on the bolster to see if it clips into place. And it does not clip into place. The head is the correct size, but the material at the base of it is too misshapen. I try to fix this with a file, but when that doesn't work, I clean it up on the belt sander instead. But, I can only do that on this one end. For the other end of the pin, it must already be on the knife with both blades in place. So I'm starting to doubt at this point that I can make this thing work. There, this fits. Now I study on how to create the head on the other end of the pin. After a couple of false starts, I have figured out an approach. First, I take the two feeler gauges and cut a slot in the ends so that I can slide them over the pin. My first thought was to offset the gauges or have them facing opposite directions to keep that pin as round as I could while I pin it. I go ahead and cut the pin, guessing at how much spare material I'll need for a head that's going to be pinned much larger than normal. Here is where I finally realized that it would peen much better if I put the two feeler gauges under that main blade and pin it against the blade. Things begin to go much more smoothly after this. I will do a couple of test fits as I go to see that the head will still clip into place. The handles do not clip into place as smoothly as they did with the original rivets, but they do clip into place. On other test fits, I'm checking to see how tight the blades are. I'm taking longer than absolutely necessary, but you have to remember, I'm experimenting with this. I'm trying to figure it all out as I go. I've never done this. I've never seen anyone do it, or even read of anyone trying it before. Though I am certain that other people have done it, and that's the one thought that keeps me moving forward. Now, I've already turned these pins down to the correct size, according to my digital calipers anyway, but I'm having trouble getting the pins inserted by hand. So now I'm going to show you a dirty trick that I've used a few times on some knives. In the past, I've tried turning the pin down slightly smaller than original, but that's rarely worked like I wanted it to. A pin that's even a little bit too small just doesn't work well. It doesn't pin into place well. Inserting it with a drill, however, often works for these stubborn pins. Doing this can also severely damage the scale on the far side of the knife if it doesn't go through straight, but thankfully this time it worked well. You see, every technique has its strong points and its drawbacks. Now I will test the blades before I pin everything together. And I'm certainly glad that I did, because this pin blade does not fit correctly. The kick is too short and the blade sits too far down into the blade well. I can't even get it back out. I can't get to the nail nick to open it. Now, if the blade only sits a tiny bit too deep, you can peen the edges of the kick to cause it to sit up a little bit higher, but this one sits far too deep in the knife for that. I'll need to make some kind of spacer to sit down on the spring where the kick touches the spring. The replacement blade here looked correct, but it was not correct. Tiny details can make a huge difference in a pocket knife. Had I been repairing this knife for someone else, I would have taken it apart and found another blade. But this knife is for me, and it's a user, so I'm going to solder a tiny bit of brass onto the spring in order to lift this blade up enough to fit properly. I first tin the brass with a little bit of solder, then I'll hold it up against the spring and solder the two together. I'm using flux paste on both pieces before heating them. Now this is a lead-free plumbing solder and paste, and I use an inexpensive blue flame cigarette lighter to heat them. I used to have a propane hand torch, but it's bulkier, and it doesn't want to work well in the wintertime in this unheated shop. I think the gases freeze up. I can always put the cigarette lighter in my pocket to get it warm, so it always works every time. Here I am smoothing the spacer. It's a bit wider than the spring, and it needs to be the same width or slightly more narrow so that the spring can move freely. And here comes another test fit. Now the blade sits proud when closed, which means I made the spacer a little bit too thick. So I'll use my rotary tool and sanding drum to remove a little bit of that brass spacer. It's too tall right now, and it's just lifting the blade up too far. You probably noticed that I used a smaller pin for that last test fit, but at least it showed me that the spring spacer I made is just about right. Now I will compress the springs in a vise and insert the correct size pin. The only problem now is the blade is not centered and it's catching on the handle liner. So I will try to crink the blade, which is an effort to slightly bend that blade so that it sits better in the blade well. This is something I wish I could avoid, as it often breaks a blade in the attempt to crank it, but this time it works okay. Now that everything appears correct, I will cut and file the pins to length. I've decided not to peen these pins, but to try spinning the heads of them instead. This is a process that uses a drill press to put pressure on the pin as a tool spins against it, flaring out the pin. This technique is one that's used by most cutlery companies and has been for the last 50 years or more, and if it works, it'll give this knife a more authentic look. I've got a set of these that a fellow gave me, a fellow member of AAPK. It is designed to spin pins down. Now, this is a part of a set that was I guess you'd say one you could buy from a knife supply store. He never did like the way it worked, and I didn't either. I have successfully made one, but it was a bit smaller for a smaller size pin, so I think I'm going to try to make another one. It's made from a set screw. Get about an inch long set screw. One end has the little dimple in it, you can see right there. I will leave that end sticking out, chuck the other end in the chuck of my drill. We'll taper it down. That concave dimple in the center of this pin spinner should leave the pin with a smooth, domed look. But the reason that I'm tapering the end of it down to that is to allow me to be able to see when it's centered on the pin when I'm using it. This must be centered on the pin for it to work. What I want. So to use it, I've got another one here that's on a piece of metal for an anvil. Chuck this one up. try it and see how it works now. Drop oil on that. It has been years since I last used one of these, and I forgot that you have to put a lot of pressure on that pin with the drill press. If it slips off, it'll ruin the handle before you can stop it. But when it works correctly, it can make for some beautiful pins. Now, I have to be 100% sure that not only is it centered on the top of the pin, but that the bottom of the pin stays on that lower anvil. If it slips off, it's also disastrous. You know, there are several things that can happen when you're spinning pins on a pocket knife, and most of those things are bad. You know, there's no polishing needed for this knife, so my last step is to reshape this pin blade. My replacement blade is worn and tipped, but it should only take a moment with a 180 grit belt to make it look good again. After it's in the shape that I want, I will sharpen it on the sander. Now, I don't normally like to sharpen a knife on a sander, but in reshaping the blade, the blade edge is as dull as the back of the spine. So I'm just going to establish the bevel again with the sander, and I'll sharpen it the way I want by hand later. The main blade has a little bit of rust, but I will also clean that by hand. The main doesn't look like it's ever been sharpened since it left the factory, and it looks as though it's seen very little, if any, use. Hey everybody, and here is the knife. I have to say I'm very pleased with how it turned out. The pin spinner was not as good as I wanted it to be. Again, I've made one before, but it was for smaller pins. And on this one, the ends of the pin, rather than being smoothly domed, were almost peaked. It wasn't a real sharp point, but it did come up to somewhat of a point, and I had to flatten those out just a little bit. So what I need to do is to reshape the end of my pin spinner. I could show you how to do that. Occasionally you have to on one that you use. There was a knife mechanic friend of mine who had done this for years and years and years. He's the one who showed me how to make the pin spinners and how to sharpen them as the ends of them wear down or wear out, and to put that concave part back in the end of it. So I can play around with those to see if I can get them better. I should have used some test stock before I used it on this knife, but in a sense, this knife is my test piece for this. This is one I intend on keeping. I've been carrying it. It's been a couple of weeks since I finished the repairs. I've carried it quite often since then. I love a Barlow anyway, but to have one that you repaired yourself just has a little extra feeling to it, a good feeling in carrying it. But yeah, I'm proud that we're able to make the Swinden key or Swinden rivet without having to mess up these bolsters. That's not something I would do on most knives. Most of the time I will still drill through and pin them through solid if I have to replace a blade on a Schrade knife with a Swinden rivet. but it's good to know that I can do it. It's a new skill that I developed. I'm sure if I have to do it again, it would go a little faster, hopefully a little smoother, just from the things I learned. But this one did turn out well. The blades, you see, have good snap. There's no excessive side-to-side wobble or wiggle in the blades. A good opening and closing snap on both of them. Yeah, just overall, I'm very pleased with the knife. I have wanted one of these Schrade Barlows for a while with the scroll work on the bolsters or engraving on the bolsters, just because they are a pretty knife. I probably would be happier had I put some bone handles on it. These plastic handles are pretty, and it's some of the better simulated bone that I've seen. But I don't know, there's just something different about good, beautiful bone handles, especially as they age, rather than these plastic ones. But I'm happy with the knife. I'm going to leave it as is. I'm going to continue to carry it in my pocket. Now, the one thing, I did not like having to put this spring spacer in there. I'm not sure if I can get the light just right where you can see it on camera, but I can see a shiny spot down in there by eye. I can see it very well. But I just don't think I'll be able to get it on the camera. But either way, yeah, it's in there. You can see it, but it's not very obvious. And over time, as that brass gets a patina on it, it'll look more like the rest of the spring. It'll be even less obvious. If someone were digging in there, trying to clean lint out of it or something, you might feel that there's a bump, but there's no sharp edges. I rounded off that brass after I put it on there, after it's soldered in place. And so, nothing's going to catch on it or cause problems with that. But yeah, great knife, very good looking. I love the engraved bolsters. Love that I was able to make a Swinden rivet for it, which is not something I've ever done before, and it was just kind of fun to be able to learn a new technique, develop a new skill, and one we can put to use in the future if we ever need to. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've enjoyed it half as much as I've enjoyed working on the knife. Thank you all for watching. May God bless you. We'll see you next time. Bye.